Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait just 1 minute for the audience to log into Zoom, and then we will get started. All right. Good morning to everyone joining from Washington, and good evening to everyone tuning in from Asia. Today's webinar is Many Sanctions, Few Friends, How the Myanmar Junta Grapples with Its Grip on Power. I'm Pam Kennedy, a research analyst with Stimson's East Asia program, and I'm joined by Hunter Marston, a PhD candidate at Australian National University and an adjunct research fellow at La Trobe Asia. Hunter studies great power competition in Southeast Asia, and he recently wrote an analysis for Stimson on this very topic, which we will put a link to in the chat. So today, we're going to dig deeper into the Myanmar junta's various lifelines, its support from countries such as China and Russia, the rationale of these partners, and how long the junta can sustain itself through these relationships. I will ask Hunter to share his thoughts and analysis first, and then we will move into a Q&A discussion. So if you would like to submit a question, please send it through the Q&A function in Zoom. And with that, Hunter, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Pam. Thank you to the Stimson Center for inviting me here. It's quite the privilege, and thank you to everyone who's joining this morning or evening, depending on where you are. Before I begin, I just want to briefly acknowledge the ongoing gravity of the situation in Myanmar and express my solidarity with those resisting the military and the coup of 2021. Pam mentioned the expression lifelines, which I think is a good theme to sort of open up on. What I'll be talking about is the junta's foreign relations with sort of key partners, mostly looking at China and Russia and their roles in sustaining the SAC regime. But perhaps rather than sort of life support, it's better to phrase these as lifelines in the sense of who wants to be a millionaire, and looking at sort of, that their role is peripheral, not critical to regime survival. With that, I'm going to share my slides, and please let me know if I've got the screen right. Great. So this presentation is based on a commentary I wrote for the Stimson Center about the role of international sanctions and looking ahead at regime survival, what it means for domestic battlefield dynamics, etc. Here's a brief overview of my remarks. I'll first open up with just touching on recent sanctions by the United States and partner governments before summarizing my key points in the argument, zooming out a little bit to look at the macroeconomic picture, what the junta's economy and sort of survival look like, prospects of survival look like going forward, and touching especially on the roles of China and Russia before wrapping up with a look at extra actors if I have time. So firstly, the summer, June to August roughly, was a tough time for the Myanmar junta. The US announced sanctions on the MFTB and MICB, which manage the junta's overseas reserves and access to foreign currency holdings overseas. So this was limiting the junta's ability to access critical reserves in overseas banks. In August, the Myanmar Central Bank directed the sorry, I'm just missing my notes here. Central Bank opened new accounts to get around existing sanctions on Mogi by European governments. The United States has since announced sanctions on the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, which is a key source for the junta's foreign reserves and incoming revenue, over $1 billion a year. Also in August, Shui Bianpu Oil and Gas, the top supplier of fuel to the military, dissolved, presumably to evade existing sanctions on their ability to generate revenue. Singapore's UOB, which is a major bank holding Myanmar overseas accounts, also directed its bank and services to cut ties with Myanmar banks, thereby limiting the junta's ability to conduct transactions with Singaporean banking entities. And following the next month, Bangladesh's Sonali Bank, a state-owned bank, froze over $1 million in Myanmar assets in their accounts, indicating that this is probably starting to cause some frustration in the junta. Deputy Finance Minister Maung Win blamed the financial instability in the country on U.S. sanctions, saying that they're hurting our government's programs such as education, health, and infrastructure building, importers and exporters, and any person or organizations using foreign banking services. So the main points I want to make here are that, while sanctions are starting to make life a bit difficult for the junta, they're not going to be what bring it down. So the recipe of sanctions plus battlefield losses leading to regime collapse is tenuous. The junta doesn't need foreign friends to survive. They certainly help, and I'm going to look at some of those key relationships. Perhaps it's best to recall Lord Palmerston's saying that there are no permanent enemies, nor permanent friends, only permanent interests. And the permanent interest of the Myanmar junta, of course, is regime survival. Therefore, ultimately, battlefield dynamics are what is going to determine political change in the country. The international arena has always been second to the Myanmar junta. Early on, after the coup, when pressed by UN Special Envoy to Myanmar, Christine Schreiner-Bergener, Deputy General of the SAC, General So Win, told her, we're used to sanctions. We've lived through sanctions before. We've lived through international isolation. We're prepared to weather that storm once again. And we have to learn to walk with only a few friends. I think that sort of saying still holds a lot of meaning for the Myanmar junta and its vision of the world. There's a lot of info here. I'm just going to sort of summarize by saying the coup actually didn't wreck Myanmar's economy. Myanmar's economy was particularly badly hit by COVID, and inbound investment has already recovered nearly to pre-coup levels. So economic mismanagement as a result of the coup and the general's just disastrous economic policies has had really ruinous policies or ruinous influence on the overall state of the economy and investor confidence. But we're already seeing a slight uptick in foreign direct investment coming in. Singapore remains the largest investor, China right behind them. So the junta has a few core partners. You can see Min Aung Hlaing, the senior general of the SAC here, just beaming on his first meeting with Vladimir Putin last year in Vladivostok at the Eastern Economic Forum. And he's also had senior level engagement from various Chinese representatives over the last 2 years who he's courted to sustain economic investment in Myanmar's infrastructure and energy projects. China's support to the junta is multifaceted. China remains Myanmar's largest trading partner, its second largest source of FDI after Singapore, as I mentioned, and its political support within the UN Security Council is also key to deflecting criticism and ultimately condemnation and any pressure from the international community, which might enforce stronger action. Notably, though, Beijing has limits to its patience and abstained from a December 2022 UN Security Council resolution expressing deep concern with the situation. And at the same time, beginning around that time, Myanmar's or China's engagement with the Myanmar junta has seen a slight uptick. So you'll see in the slide on the right side here, from December through May, there was consistent monthly engagement between Chinese representatives and junta representatives, which has actually slowed down in the intervening months just quite recently. So that's probably something to keep an eye on. Russia and its support I would characterize as more opportunistic and less critical to the regime's survival. Russia obviously has provided an abundance of arms and weaponry to the Myanmar military, which is critical to its asymmetric air advantage over resistance forces. But this relationship remains sort of limited in terms of actually official engagement. Min Aung Hlaing has visited Russia annually since 2011. Actually, that's not quite right, but he's visited Russia a whole lot since 2011 and much more regularly in the 2010s. He's also forged close relationships with Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu of Russian armed forces, and the two militaries have recently cooperated with naval exercises just occurring last week. Also notable is the February 2023 agreement on nuclear energy cooperation through Russia's state-owned nuclear energy enterprise, Rosatom. Here's just a quick picture of the naval exercises which took place. Other actors, which I'll touch on if I have time, neighbors India and Thailand are critical. And although trade with India remains somewhat limited, the recent Caledon multimodal transport project does signal major opportunity for increased cross-border trade and maritime commerce. Japan has always been the largest provider of development assistance and remains engaged in the country economically. Both India and Japan, I think, are in some sense just competing with China and trying to provide alternatives to Myanmar in the long run, but have their own clear economic self-interest in mind. Thailand similarly, but it also shares a border and is quite concerned about humanitarian disaster in Myanmar affecting Thailand's security, as well as the cross-border flow of drugs and other illicit substances. I'm going to just end there and save more time for Q&A.
Thank you, Hunter. I think what strikes me about these relationships is that the junta has managed to maintain is that there has to be obviously a permanent interest, a compelling interest in the junta staying in power to provide that level of support when there is the possibility for a viable other option like NUG or some sort of resistance coalition. So what do you think would be the main factor that would have to change in order to shift these countries' interests in supporting the junta in the ways that they do currently?
Yeah, it's a great question, Pam. I think, arguably we're already seeing that in the case of China. China has sent in special forces into Shan State to work around Myanmar security forces who have been unable to enforce law and order in the country's north, especially with regards to criminal syndicates and cyber scam operations. China has also announced warrants for the arrest of top United Wa State Army leaders, which have traditionally been seen as somewhat of a proxy for China in Myanmar. And it's clear that China has lost patience with the Myanmar junta's ability to enforce any type of crackdown on these wanted persons. So I think China has both dialed down its senior level engagement with the junta while also ratcheting up its sort of own willingness to go in and just sort of crack the whip and extract both Chinese citizens who are imprisoned in these criminal syndicates, as well as arresting the leaders of those scam operations, which have gone unchecked, despite the junta's directives to arrest certain leaders of those criminal syndicates. With regards to Russia, I'd argue because the relationship, I think, is ultimately more opportunistic and less deep in many ways, that Russia will actually be more patient and forgiving of the regime's ineptitude. And therefore, I think we're unlikely to see any significant change from Moscow in the near future.
That's very interesting. And as a follow-up question, as you know, Operations 1027 and 1107 are squeezing the junta with a multi-front offensive, and it's assumed with China's tacit approval, because one of the stated goals of the operations is to crack down on the scam operations. And so with, as you say, China's more proactive interest in cracking down on the criminal activities along the border, do you also anticipate a broader shift in China's approach to the junta? Could it be followed by some, additional efforts from other partners of the junta currently?
Yeah, I think Operations 1027 and 1107 or 1101 have certainly rattled analysts and sort of alerted us to the possibility that the regime may be more vulnerable than traditionally understood. I would hope that recognition extends to experts in China and hopefully those advising the Chinese government on its Myanmar policies. It would seem, as I noted, with regards to China's patience and willingness to intervene directly in Hua State and Shan State, that Beijing has shifted from sort of a diplomatic engagement, sending foreign ministers and deputy foreign ministers, special envoys to Naypyidaw, to one more issues-based. That is, it's sending its public security minister, Wang Xiaobong, to meet with security forces in Naypyidaw. It's sending its security forces into the country to tackle issues of crime. And even in Assistant Foreign Minister Nong Rong's recent visit to Naypyidaw, he's calling for dialogue and stability, and particularly interested in the security of Chinese investment projects, which I should note are also critical in Shan State and across Sagaing down to Rakhine State, all major conflict zones, sources of resistance. So China's infrastructure investments, these are billions of dollar projects, oil and gas pipelines and mining are critical to China's continued extraction of resources to sustain its own economy. These are all affected by instability in the country, and China is alert to the implications there, but I don't think has developed a sort of holistic policy to respond to how does it engage the junta based on a recognition that actually it's the source of instability for its economic interests.
Makes sense. Thank you. And we have a couple of questions that have just come in on Southeast Asia and ASEAN. So Gavril Torrijos asks, how do you measure ASEAN's influence in relation to China or Russia's influence on the junta? Like, what sort of indicators do you look for? And Eric White also asks a related question. Could you further discuss the role and significance of like Thailand and some of these other ASEAN countries in the regime's ability to perpetuate its control over Myanmar?
Yeah, good questions. I'll go in the order you posed them, Pam. So first, ASEAN's influence in relation to China or Russia's influence on the junta. I don't think ASEAN has much ability to influence China or Russia's influence. Sorry, that's a lot of repetition. ASEAN is important to Myanmar to an extent, but it's mostly from the perspective of how ASEAN suits the general's need for diplomatic theater. And I think early on, after 2021, those limits were sort of exhausted, and ASEAN recognizes that the Myanmar junta is useless and is not going to go along with its 5-point consensus. So therefore, the generals, seeing through this sort of unenforceable consensus, have played ASEAN members off of one another. So it's perfectly happy to say, look, some ASEAN partners want to sort of renormalize us and integrate us into the body, while other more democratic countries and those pushing for political change in Myanmar, including Indonesia, Malaysia, even Singapore, are not going to be able to unite an ASEAN consensus around the need for stronger action on Myanmar. So Myanmar benefits from that ASEAN division to a great extent, and ASEAN is not going to be sort of the multilateral body that comes in and sort of settles Myanmar's political future in the way that it has past conflicts, including Cambodia, or even Myanmar's integration into ASEAN back in the 90s. Just looking to Eric's question on the role and significance of Thailand, I think Thailand is probably the most important partner within ASEAN for Myanmar and the junta. Thailand imports something like 20% of its total gas from Myanmar alone. To the extent of, sorry, I'm just going back to one of my slides, $2.4 billion in gas in 2022. And I'm sorry, the 20% figure refers to Myanmar's total exports. I think it's something similar for Thailand's net imports of gas into the country. I just don't have that info in front of me. That might be in my commentary, which I think will be linked here. But Thailand is also an important diplomatic and security partner. It's also worth mentioning that Min Aung Hlaing is the godson of former Thai sort of military insider Prem, if I'm not mistaken. So there are familial relations between these juntas. Myanmar military and Thai military have operated quite closely on cross-border security issues. And at the same time, bad actors within both militaries have been facilitating the flow of drugs and human smuggling. So there are a number of interests which unite the two, and I think those are not going away despite any political change in either Thailand with the recent elections or Myanmar going forward.
That's a really interesting point about Min Aung Hlaing being the godson of a Thai junta figure. We had a question from Yuri Krivonos about what it would take to make the junta change its policy, because obviously this is not the first time that the Myanmar military has staged a coup in Myanmar. And I think that's an interesting question because ASEAN, as you say, has sort of exhausted all of its avenues so far, pending some sort of big shift in how ASEAN functions or the power of the next chair. Do you think that there is something that Southeast Asian neighbors of Myanmar could do to change the calculus for the junta within the region?
Yeah, I've been pushing for, and I know others have as well, tougher action by Singapore in particular. And the US has continually harped on this in sort of a polite or diplomatic way, trying to get Singapore to close banks that provide access to funds overseas for Myanmar generals. That it's a critical source of the generals' ability to sustain both their own livelihoods and therefore interest in regime survival, but also the military's ability to operate with joint ventures in Singapore to import defense technology, which has continued after the coup. More recently, Singapore's government has faced a great deal of scrutiny and has finally begun cracking down on this to an extent, although still not to the level where I think we're going to see the regime's access to overseas funds completely cut off. So Singapore has a lot more work to do. At the same time, those democratic countries in ASEAN who want to see a stable return to democracy in Myanmar could do something on their own, realizing that the 5-point consensus is not going to be what holds the junta accountable. What that is, I'm not quite certain, but I think there's a need to work more closely together there.
Sumata also asks about the Thai border crossings, because I think Thailand has perhaps some of the strongest interests of any of Myanmar's neighbors, given how porous the border is. And in all past instances of coups by the Myanmar junta, people have fled across the border to continue the resistance from relative safety in Thailand. And so Stu asks that it seems that there's been a lot of tolerance from Thailand to have not just refugees, but also armed groups moving into their territory for brief periods of time. How should we think about Thailand's relative tolerance of these border incursions? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed picture. It's been a long time since I've been to Mae Sot, but my understanding is that Thailand has probably a fairly decent understanding of the extent of the footprint of resistance groups within Thailand. So there are millions of Thai Myanmar people, largely Karen population, working on the western border, as well as all the way through Bangkok across Thailand in a number of industries, many of whom are unregistered. The UN numbers or the numbers of refugees that Thailand's government reports to the UN vastly understate the actual number of people from Myanmar living in the country. But so there's already sort of a bit of a gray zone and major unreported economic earnings that are critical to Myanmar peoples back home, which are seeing income shared with families across the border. At the same time, as Stu has mentioned here, the resistance groups that operate on the western border of Myanmar have oftentimes sort of relied on the border to either hide networking and operations which are not based in Thailand, but that are definitely pouring across the border a little bit in terms of being one step removed from the Myanmar security apparatus. Although Thailand has its military and police forces have cracked down on some of these networks. Since the coup, it's not simply just the KNU and Karen groups. It's actually probably there's a much wider network than I'm aware of, which is working to both raise revenue for the PDFs and also to liaise with various ethnic armed groups. So these networks have solidified, and I think Thailand is probably quite vigilant to that. Is one reason they've gone in and rounded up various actors and actually deported them back to Myanmar, knowing full well they're probably facing execution. So I think that's something the international community should press Thailand on, to be more mindful of the just gross human rights violations that it's forcing by going in and then rounding up certain persons in border communities, especially Mae Sot.
That's a really good point. And speaking of the international community, you said that sanctions won't be enough to take down the junta. It's used to this. It has some lifelines of support. And so Murray Hebert asks, if Washington would impose total sanctions against Mogi, do you think that could inflict grave enough injuries on the junta to change their ability to continue?
Short answer is no. And thank you, Murray, for your kind words and for attending today. Look forward to seeing you again. I basically, I argued sanctions are not going to be what brings down the junta. U.S. sanctions certainly have often outpaced the international community's willingness to act on Myanmar in certain ways, but are largely symbolic for the most part. And I say that because the Myanmar junta has such little trade with U.S. Business, and U.S. business has such a small footprint in the country. When it comes to Mogi, the key directive here in the recent sanctions earlier this month or late last month was that it's barring certain financial services or U.S. businesses from conducting financial services with Mogi. It's not sort of the standard SCN list and total sanctions on Mogi as an entity yet. My understanding is that it will probably increase as U.S. sanctions continue to incrementally expand on Myanmar's junta. It's been a long time coming. So Canada and the EU, I believe, or UK first imposed sanctions on Mogi earlier this year or even late last year. There's been a lot of pressure on the U.S. to act similarly. And most people think it hasn't done so because of the interests of Chevron, which owned a minority stake in the Yadana gas field, which had ties to Mogi, as well as the Thai PTTE Corporation, which is an important player and stakeholder because of the alliance between the United States and Thailand, and also because of Chevron's own role in this partnership. So the U.S. didn't want to aggravate Chevron, which had been lobbying the U.S. government to slow its actions and sort of stay open for business because it protected some Myanmar people's jobs in the country. But notably, the sanctions announced say they have until foreign companies and U.S. companies doing business with Mogi have until December 15th for full compliance. Now, my understanding of that deadline is that it's either Chevron announced in February that they were withdrawing from the country and had sold or had come to an agreement to sell their stake in the Yadana gas field to Canadian firm MTI. My understanding is that that deadline is either looking out for Chevron and its interests before they wrap up the sale there, which still hasn't taken place, or it's a way to find a workaround for Canadian business to ensure that it's not allowing Mogi funds to flow through U.S. or Canadian banks. Canada hasn't imposed the same sanctions on financial services with Mogi that the United States now has. Or it could be sort of in deference to Thai interests because Thai PTTE is still going to be a majority holder in this project. But back to this question, sorry, I don't think it's going to be U.S. sanctions that bring down the regime. It's going to make it more difficult for Mogi to access funds, and the junta will have to get more creative. But as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, it's already closing or dissolving subsidiaries and opening new ones in new names. So it's an endless sort of I forget what the expression is, the Russian dolls that just sort of endlessly replicate into smaller sizes and, evade sort of U.S. whack-a-mole sanctions policies.
Yeah, clearly it's extremely complex. It's not as simple as saying Mogi is sanctioned, but trying to figure out like how to best approach it where it is doing business with its business partners. And we have a question from Sydney Tucker, who's our research associate in East Asia program. She asks, is it that sanctions aren't strong enough, or is it basically the lack of consensus among countries to implement them? So if there were more sanctions packages from Myanmar's neighbors in ASEAN or from Japan, would those make a difference? Would there be a harsher impact? Would more of a consensus help sanctions to be effective? Is that a major weak point that you see?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. I mean, there's a whole literature and debate around sanctions and their efficacy. My own take, based on limited expertise here, is that nobody wants to replicate the sanctions of the 90s and 2000s, which saw universal trade embargo or much wider, deeper sanctions on the Myanmar economy writ large, which have largely been perceived as hurting the ordinary people of Myanmar and not actually affecting regime change or political moderation, whatever the end goal in mind is. So the junta always has abilities to hoard its own access to revenue based on the willingness of certain actors to do business, and therefore they will continue to fill their coffers, and they'll just not invest in public education and health and the things that the ordinary people need. So I think it's a combination of things, Sydney. I think it's that there's little willingness or appetite for these broad-ranging sanctions, which even some people in Myanmar have called for and say, look, we're willing to suffer. We're here in solidarity, and we will find a way. Whatever you can do to bring down the regime, it'll be tough, but it's going to be sort of, it'll shorten the suffering of ordinary people by just doing these blanket sanctions. But I don't think there's an appetite in Washington or other international governments to enforce such sanctions. But what Sydney notes is that, perhaps it's the role of third-party countries like China or Japan and their unwillingness to cut off business. That could be it. The U.S. has imposed secondary sanctions on countries like North Korea, which have arguably been more effective, although still of limited utility and influencing regime calculus. So, there's a long debate to be had here, and I don't think I have by any means the final word. I would like to see more willingness to impose secondary sanctions. I mentioned already sort of my own impatience with Singapore's banks and financial entities, the permission or permissiveness for joint ventures in Singapore, which facilitate the import of defense technologies, military hardware, based on family connections and sort of sons and daughters of generals and junta cronies in Singapore and other countries, setting up these companies to do business. But then you risk alienating key partners and allies by slapping sanctions and sort of limiting their own abilities to conduct their business in those countries.
You've touched on the question from John Brandon asking about the influence that Singapore could put on the Myanmar military through the banking restrictions, divesting its investments in Myanmar, and denying all these senior generals medical treatment in Singaporean hospitals and clinics. What do you think Singapore could do to be more effective and not, avoid the conundrum that the US has in trying to sanction through third countries? Can Singapore put its own pressure on the junta to a greater extent?
Yeah, thank you, John. Nice to see you here. I think you're spot on. This is something I would like to see. I think Singapore has a great deal of influence that is untapped. UOB cutting off its own ties to Myanmar banks and Myanmar bank account holders, limiting their ability to extract funds from Myanmar and only conduct transactions between UOB bank accounts is one step. If other Singapore banks did something similar, it might actually sway it might put more of a cramp on Myanmar generals' ability to move around assets. But until this is sort of a wider, comprehensive policy, I just don't see it limiting the general's ability to, go to Singapore for healthcare, like you're saying. I don't know if everyone can see the Q&A here. John's mentioned the willingness of Singapore's or the ability of Myanmar generals and generals to access healthcare in Singapore, things like that. Singapore cherishes its status as a sort of neutral player in many ways. It's a democracy; it stands on principle, and therefore it's been willing to impose sanctions on Russia in light of its violations of Ukrainian sovereignty. But when it comes to Myanmar, it's sort of been dragging its feet a lot more, and I think Singapore is a core partner which could probably step up its own influence here by acting a little bit tougher on Myanmar, which is not sort of an existential issue to Singapore in many ways. Cutting off financial ties with Myanmar is not going to hurt Singapore's economy.
That is a good point. We have several questions from Zakabuza, so I'll start with the first. He asks about there's been a purge of the senior junta officials, especially those responsible for the economic management. Do you interpret that as infighting, or are you seeing the State Administrative Council looking for scapegoats for their own mismanagement of the economy and the impact of sanctions?
Yeah, I would like to hear Zach's take. I know we're not here to put him on the speaker. He's done that several times in the past. I have no real insights here. I'm thinking of Minister of Home Affairs So Tut's recent purge. My understanding of Myanmar's own inner shufflings, it's a bit like Kremlinology. It depends who you ask. If you ask people in Myanmar, they might speculate on sort of family ties and the connections that bring about personal animuses. But the international community says, perhaps it's more about scapegoating. It's unclear to me. I don't really have a good answer there.
Okay.
But I think, in terms of, sorry to just jump in again, in terms of, when you're firing key bank personnel and those overseeing central bank policies and economic mismanagement, the junta is only digging its hole deeper. So, as they say, right, when you find yourself in a hole, the first solution is to stop digging. And Myanmar is seeming to dig itself deeper into economic turbulence by firing people and enacting just terrible banking policies.
That is a good point. But as Zach points out, Myanmar is also trying other avenues to get around the sanctions. This attempt he refers to in his question about establishing correspondent banks in Russia to avoid US dollar transactions. Could this help the junta get around their shortage of dollars and their foreign exchange reserves? Would that have a longer term impact?
Longer term impact is difficult to measure. I think this is a great question, Zach, and also nice to see you here. Again, deferring to your expertise, this is probably a conversation we could have next time we're together. But my understanding is that the conversion currency swap arrangements will facilitate Myanmar's ability to procure arms from Russia and Russia's ability to procure natural resources from Myanmar. But so that's limited to an extent that your transactions are only limited to now these two countries or any other partners willing to conduct business in rubles, which is not the strongest currency around the world. But it certainly sustains Myanmar's ability to access Russia's weaponry. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, I think it's imported roughly $500 million in Russian weaponry since the coup. That figure has probably continued to increase, but we don't have the latest data because the UN report I cite came out earlier this year, I believe. But Myanmar is also exploring this currency swap mechanism with other countries. I think it's got something similar with India in the works, if it's not already implemented. And as we know, Myanmar has not a strong cash-based economy, but the cash-based economy does not, or macroeconomic data does not capture the extent of cash-based flows which facilitate cross-border trade with China. So obviously, a great deal of weaponry and other natural resource extraction is happening across the border in a cash-based manner and not one that relies on currency swaps and wire transactions.
Still muted. That's a great point. And Zach's final question about like weathering the sanctions works better when Myanmar's economy is closed, like a corollary is North Korea, obviously, which has made an attempt at autarky, but of course is kept alive through trade with China. It's one lifeline basically remaining. So for the junta in Myanmar, does their ability to weather the sanctions still work when they are more dependent on these correspondent banks, the FDI that's coming in from even partners still like Japan, and then of course the trade with China and other partners. I'm especially curious about your thoughts about Japan's role in this. So obviously Japan is a really strong ally of the United States. So it's quite frustrating for the United States to see Japan not joining the sanctions with full-throated force. But Japan also has a really different and long-standing relationship with Southeast Asia compared to the United States.
Yeah, I'll have to think about the Japan angle to this question. The third question Zach poses here about whether the junta can weather sanctions as they incrementally impact foreign direct investment and trade. I've tried to sort of separate those two. The point I'm making is that sanctions are incrementally making it more difficult for the junta to access overseas funds, but that's not necessarily tied to the willingness of international investors and foreign governments to continue trading and investing in Myanmar. So the chart I mentioned or showed before showed only data through the end of 2021, I think. That comes from the World Bank, which showed a slight uptick after COVID, or after the coup. Sorry, COVID was what was responsible for the sharp drop in international investment, incoming FDI in Myanmar. The coup actually didn't have a significant impact on FDI flows into Myanmar. But more recently, I think the data is from April 2022 to January 2023, we've seen a resurgence to over 2 billion in FDI in Myanmar, still quite small given the size of Myanmar's economy compared to bigger countries like Bangladesh or Thailand. But this FDI is continuing to sustain the junta and continue to go to state-owned entities, especially controlling natural resources. When it comes to China's own investment in the country, I think more than half of it is in the power sector. Mining and natural resources are roughly 35% combined. So these, the junta's willingness to sell off these resources and just sort of strip mine and clear timber and sell it across the border, and that's going to continue generating revenue for the junta. Even if it's limited, it just means less investment is going to healthcare, education, the basic needs of the population, which is suffering, but it's continuing to fund the military's ability to survive. So in my mind, sanctions make it more difficult. Sanctions are going to increase pressure and might influence the thinking of individuals within the regime. I can't speculate on how that process will work itself out. But there have been signs for a long time that sort of key cronies of the USDP government, which preceded the NLD government in the early 2010s, have been frustrated with the junta's ability to govern Min Aung Hlaing's disastrous economic policies. So I think it's influencing the calculus somewhat, but it's not really hurting the generals and their wallets.
Let's shift from the economy's focused questions to a really interesting security focused question from Hien Van. How are countries with security interests in Myanmar, so like all of its neighbors, but also Russia, not a border neighbor of Myanmar, but a major arms sales source, how are they dealing with cyber scams, drug trafficking, and these other issues that really are having a major impact on the stability of the region and certainly Myanmar's internal stability? Do Myanmar's neighbors and these countries engage with the junta to, well, as you've discussed, China does, but do the other partners also engage with the junta on these issues? And are there engagements beyond China with grassroots ERO movements to solve these crimes in the areas of Myanmar where they're occurring?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm sure others are more expert here than I am. I've tried to present something of a mixed picture, right? So I've mentioned that there are certain bad actors, a number of bad actors within the Myanmar and Thailand militaries, which are facilitating such cross-border drug trafficking and human smuggling, all sorts of nefarious illicit economies, which have proliferated since the coup. The same is true in the northern Shan State and United Wa State Army controlled territory, where China has traditionally sort of let the Wa operate autonomously as the Myanmar military, because it's unable to go in there. But since the coup, these cyber scam operations have just expanded to such a degree that they have actually aggravated China and caused it to make a real priority of this issue. And we've seen in recent weeks, thousands of people that have been rounded up and deported back to China, or people who were imprisoned in these cyber scam operations sent to their home countries. But because the top leaders within these echelons and criminal rings went unpunished, and it was lower level purges of scam operators which was taking place, China, I think, lost its patience and sent in security personnel across the border into a border town of Lao Cai in Shan State, and actually did some of this work itself, because it's lost patience with the junta's ability to do so, and with the border guard forces, which are under the control of the Myanmar military, to enforce this crackdown on those within its forces, which have been benefiting from this economy, this illicit economy. And notably, China has turned against and I think there's a split in the United Wa State Army, which reflects this. But China has announced a warrant on two leaders of the United Wa State Army, which could have a major impact on the ability of the Wa to continue fighting, and what their future direction is with regards to cooperating with China on economically and also from a security dimension, but also their willingness to continue fighting against the Myanmar junta versus protecting their own interests and sort of consolidating control over territory.
It's a good point. And sort of circling back to my initial question about if China's interest in resolving or cracking down, maybe reducing the impact of these scam operations, does that represent a broader shift towards how it will work with the junta? Or is it really just about the nuances in balancing its various relationships? Obviously, China really values stability on its border, and it seems to be betting that the junta will be in power long enough that it's worth for China to engage diplomatically. But at the same time, if the junta is not willing to take care of the scam operations and the hostage taking for the people imprisoned in these operations, then China needs to step in. So how do you interpret that overall approach from China towards Myanmar?
Yeah, I think there's a common misconception that China wants stability across its border. China wants a subservient and divided state. That's been the way it operates for over 1,000 years. I'm not trying to sort of project some, evil communist conspiracy around the world here by any means. But to the extent it's able to influence events in other countries, this includes neighbors like Vietnam, as well as during the Indochina War, China has preferred to have proxies that defer to its interests, and rather than have a united democratic Myanmar, which would, I think, benefit China to an enormous degree, as exhibited somewhat under the National League for Democracy and its willingness to work with China, China has preferred to see a divided country, which is weak and unable to ally with sort of a Western democratic order, and one that it exercises some control over, which is difficult to understand or see why it would prefer this, given the extent of turbulence in the country and humanitarian outflows and the costs to the coup and post-coup conflict, which have incurred across the border in China, as well as, oftentimes Myanmar military accidentally bombing Chinese territory to try to hit these resistance groups operating near the Chinese border. So China has fueled instability by arming both ethnic armed groups and the Myanmar military, sustaining conflict, and this has now jeopardized its major economic interests in the form of oil and gas pipelines across the country, high-speed rail, other major investments which rely on the stability of territory in Shan, Sagaing, and Rakhine State to eventually implement. And China has been pressuring the Myanmar military to resume hydropower projects to guarantee the security of its investment projects. And, in the last 2 years, instead, what we've seen is maybe the occasional environmental impact survey, but no real implementation of these multi-billion-dollar projects because they're the core conflict zones of the resistance, which are opposed to military rule. So the sooner that China realizes the junta is endangering its economic and security and political interests and moves to curbing the military's ability to keep fighting, that I think we'll see a smoother, or at least in the long run, I think that will benefit China's interests.
And I'll close out with a question about great power competition, since that's your area of specialty across East Asia. Myanmar is a kind of interesting case because the U.S. is really concerned about the junta, has put together sanctions packages in the Burma Act, and humanitarian assistance as well. But China really is much more involved on the ground, sending diplomats, having a much deeper form of engagement. Do you see the sort of the imprint of great power competition between the United States and China and Myanmar, or is that not really how you would characterize US and Chinese engagement with Myanmar?
It's a great question and a really tricky one to answer. I think I'll answer it in two ways. First, I think there's an element of great power competition which has informed US and China Myanmar policy dating back to the 2000s. Arguably as far as the George W. Bush administration, which first undertook a policy review prior to Obama's own sort of outreach to Myanmar to explore whether a change in policy might better enhance U.S. ability to influence democratic change in the country. Some of this was motivated around great power competition with China and recognition that Myanmar, as an undemocratic military state, was deferent to China and essentially viewed as a Chinese proxy. So the goal of regime change was actually somewhat explicit within U.S. policy at that time, and continued to be a goal of the Obama administration in some ways, which was looking to encourage Myanmar's democratic reforms in order to draw Myanmar out of the Chinese camp and into the fold of democratic countries. Obama's line of, where there's offering a hand to unclenched fists, something like that, I think it certainly rang true in Myanmar and reflected the Obama administration's outreach to the generals at the time and encouraging the Thein Sein government to reform, most importantly by relaxing sanctions to facilitate trust and also U.S. investment in the country. China was caught on the back foot by those reforms and actually regained its stature in the country as a result, ironically, of the incoming more democratic party in the National League for Democracy in 2016. Aung San Suu Kyi was a pragmatist and worked quite closely with China and recognized that, China's a large neighbor. You need it to get by in the world and also to see your economy grow. And she recognized the importance of China to Myanmar. I think the NUG has also signaled sort of a similar pragmatism. So it's anyone's guess which way sort of a future democratic Myanmar might tilt. But since the coup, U.S.-China competition has prevented any high-level talk about a range of issues. But, Myanmar is very far down that list. And I early on after the coup suggested that one possible avenue to change in Myanmar would be to see the U.S. and China engage in talks and pressure the Myanmar junta together. to pursue a return to democracy, which is in the interest, as I've argued, for both countries. We're not going to see that. U.S. and China are barely talking to each other about the most important geopolitical global issues of the day. So I don't think Myanmar is going to top the list of the agenda anytime soon. But I think, in that sense, great power competition has limited the ability of the superpowers to work together to change Myanmar in a more positive direction.
That's a really good point. And in terms of India-China competition, do you also see them as competitive players in Myanmar, maybe to a greater extent since they're regional?
Yes. India has, since the 2000s, seen a sea change in its Myanmar policy, has gone from one of principled values-based foreign policy to one of pragmatism and more security-oriented policy by partnering with the Myanmar military. And even after the coup, has continued to do so. I think it was 2021 when India's Navy gifted the Myanmar Navy its first submarine, which has essentially zero utility for Myanmar. It's not a blue sea naval country, but much of this is I think, with an eye to keeping up with China's relationship in the country and building sustaining influence. India has also cooperated quite closely with Myanmar's security forces to crack down on resistance groups in western Chin State and on the border in Mizoram and on the Indian side of the border as well. So both countries benefit, or both countries' militaries benefit from security cooperation in this regard, counterinsurgency. But India's economic footprint in the country is minuscule compared to China's. So there's a long way to go for India to catch up with China economically.
Thank you. And so we are just about at the top of the hour, and we have just one last question from Buitha Thang. What happens to the Burma Act now? Is there any hope for the resistance groups in getting some assistance? I know one big issue with the Burma Act is that the US is only providing non-lethal aid, which is defined quite narrowly for Myanmar. So it's not even as far as like communication support or something. What are your views on the Burma Act so far?
Yeah, the Burma Act so far, there was a lot of hope that it would signal, or that it signaled a willingness for the United States to start supporting the resistance as it explicitly called for. And since then, as others well know, and Boita himself and I have talked about, there is zero willingness within the U.S. administration at the top level, National Security Council, to provide technical assistance to resistance groups in Myanmar. So sadly, I think this is going to be blocked by the White House, not from the will of other branches of government to do more. Also, the State Department is opposed to technical and military assistance, even non-lethal assistance in the form of communications and humanitarian assistance. Not humanitarian assistance, technical assistance and other non-lethal measures to support resistance groups. It's also partly reflects just the ignorance within Washington of, who's operating and who's who. The U.S. has very little, if any, relationships with ethnic armed groups to begin with, and it has less of knowledge on the PDFs and the extent of their own networks and operations. So I don't think we can hold out hope there. But the Senate is perhaps going to vote soon on a new resolution, which will have the backing of Senator Mitch McConnell and could put the pressure on operators in Washington to do more. So we'll see if that elevates the issue once again. But I think right now the Burma Act has been on the back burner since its passage late last year.
Thank you. Well, so we are just about at 10 a.m. Washington time, so we'll have to end here. But I know that everyone in the audience and Hunter will continue to watch the developments in Myanmar closely. And so thank you, Hunter, for joining today to discuss this really key aspect and so many other related questions of why the junta has been so successful at staying in power so far. And maybe there are paths for that to change in the future. And thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in today, for sending in your questions. This was a really interesting and wide-ranging discussion.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you, Pam, for moderating.
Me too. Everyone have a great day and a good night. And